We're going to be going through what my take on the AEOS Cup meta is going to be, as well as give you guys a tier list. And for those of you guys that are a little bit newer to competitive, maybe you haven't been following it this much this year, we're going to go over just a very brief explanation on how draft works as well. If you haven't had a draft game, or maybe you need a draft explanation. So starting with draft, each team gets 2 bans. The team that's going to be first picking, which is going to be the team on the left side, is going to be given the first ban of the game as well. And we'll talk about what I think the bans are going to look like. For now, we'll just take a generically strong Pokemon, maybe like Hoopa. And the second pick side is always going to be banning what they think the strongest Pokemon in the game are, generally. And that's kind of how it is going in this meta. So for now, they might be banning Buzzwole. It goes back to the first pick side to be able to do their ban. Maybe we'll say ban Crustle. And then second pick, they get the final ban of the game. They don't want to give up something like Leafeon, so maybe they'll go ahead and ban out Leafeon. Right, so now first pick gets their 1 pick. And then you go 1, their 1, 2, their 2, 3, then 3, 4, 4, 5, and then 5. I don't know why that was so hard to explain. So, you know, they might pick Espeon, and then from here, the draft will just go back and forth. But for you guys to be able to understand what Pokemon, at least I think, are going to be really strong, and we're going to put together a tier list live on stream. You might be watching this in the future in YouTube. That's cool too. I'll go through what the tiers represent here as well. So the S plus tier, I'm just going to go ahead and put the Pokemon in there that you would have seen me put in the draft as well. This would be Buzzwole and Leafeon. I think Leafeon got deleted. I can't find it. How are these Pokemon sorted? Should it not be beside Glaceon? Oh, there it is. I wonder what order this is supposed to be in. This is by when the Pokemon were released. Okay. I guess they get added subsequently. Okay. Good to know. So the S plus tier, this is going to be the tier that I think is bans, like what second pick is generally going to be banning. These are the best Pokemon in the game. The way the meta kind of works right now is Leafeon is really good, but if it's Leafeon into Buzzwole, it's not as good. So you kind of can't give up Buzzwole, because if you do and get Leafeon in exchange, Leafeon kind of gets countered by Buzzwole. So when you're a second pick, you're just banning these 2 Pokemon out. So when you watch AEOS Cup, which is going to be in person in London on next weekend, so the weekend of April, what would it be, April 3rd and 4th, I think? No, April 9th and 10th is when AEOS Cup should be. Next weekend, basically. When you're watching it and you see teams from second pick not ban Buzzwole or Leafeon, you can kind of expect that something weird is going to be happening. Either they're letting them through intentionally and they have a way to counter it, or maybe they're not up to speed on the meta, which I doubt is going to happen for those teams. So expect these 2 to be banned for sure. And then, all right, so that's the S plus tier. The S tier, I think this will comprise most of your first round picks and sets of picks. So it might be the first pick Pokemon. Some of these will be banned by the first pick side. April 6th and 7th. Okay, cool. Some of these Pokemon might make it through the draft, but generally these are the really strong Pokemon and make up a majority of the team compositions in the S tier. In the A tier, these are Pokemon that might be reserved for more counter picks. In their counter pick state, they might be really, really strong, and almost like S or S plus tier level Pokemon in those spots. But because they have a lot of weaknesses that can be exploited, they can't be picked higher in the draft, and as a result, they're lower in the tiers, right? And we'll get to it when we get to the A tier. But Slowbro will probably be a really good example of an A tier Pokemon, a Pokemon that's generically really, really, really strong in a lot of situations, but can also get exploited in a lot of different ways, making it not the best option, but really good in certain situations. The B tier, just Pokemon that are generally weaker than the A tier mons. They might have similar kind of strengths, where in the counter pick situation, you can expect to have really good situations with them, but generically they might not be as good. C tier, just moving down the list, you know, maybe a more niche Pokemon that might only be reserved for people that are really specialists on them on, or they serve like a very typical or very specific kind of strategy, you know? The next tier would be the D tier. These are Pokemon that are pretty weak, but maybe not completely unplayable. still considered quite weak, usually a better option, and the F tier, probably close to unplayable Pokemon. Teams are either trolling or, you know, there's some new technology that they might be investing in that the F tier might represent. Oh, cool. Let's start up with the S tier of Pokemon here. I alluded to it when we were looking at the draft really quickly, but I think Hoopa, probably one of the best Pokemon in the game. It goes through phases. It goes through own meta games where Hoopa is considered to be regarded really high. Sometimes it goes down. We might see a lot of Hoopa at EUIC. There's a chance that maybe teams might forego it. They might be too afraid to rely simply on like the macro advantage that Hoopa gets you and opt to play something a little bit safer like Blissey or Clef or Eld. But Hoopa as it stands is the best support in the game to win you the early game. It's the only support that has a stun from a ranged position. Immediately at level 4, you have the ability to reset your team and have the ability to move up and down the map really, really quickly. It's the only support in the game that can reliably invade the enemy team and win against a lot of different Pokemon. For example, if the other team has a weak early game jungler, I'm talking things like Urshifu, Candle, Gardevoir, Venusaur, right? All these Pokemon are really susceptible to being level 1 invaded by the Hoopa, which is something you will see a good amount of. On top of that, Hoopa's Unite move is really, really powerful for the end game. If you ever have a point lead, it's really easy to stay further ahead, as you can have more teammates backcapping than the other team and then pull them back in with the Hoopa Rings Unbound. Or if you're losing, you get to make a similar play, right? Hoopa just has too much versatility and offers a lot to teams. And I think the higher and higher the level of competition goes, the more and more Hoopa we'll see. But Hoopa does have a weakness in the late game where if you weren't able to capitalize on its strengths and you ended up falling behind, Hoopa is a support that lacks defensive capabilities, right? Blissey, Clefable, they have direct heals or shields or whatever it might be. Hoopa's Portal takes some time to reset their team. So there's a bit of a weakness that can be exploited there, right? And a Pokemon that excels at dominating the early game that we've seen really rise up into the meta is Espeon, right? So Espeon's one of the things is it is really hard to invade level 1, right? Because its Swift is a really solid secure. The Hoopa can't really do anything about that. And then Espeon only needs to take 1 buff to be able to make it out of the early game. Espeon only needs 1 buff in the early game to come online. So what you'll see oftentimes happen in a lot of these tournament games or competitive games is the Espeon is going to take out the Xatu and then go directly to the red buff, right? Use that red buff to go into the top path, and then they can apply pressure simply at level 4 with stored power, right? Instead of them clearing the entire jungle and being late to be able to get to a lane, they'll get there really early. That also allows them to share the rest of the experience in the jungle with a teammate. And Espeon's probably the strongest character, maybe after Leafeon, that can do this level 4 gank, you know, quote unquote level 4 gank. So, and then throughout the game, Espeon, stored power, Psybeam provides a lot of damage. Psybeam's a reliable secure on objectives. Espeon's Unite move is really good in team fights to help set up engages for the rest of your team. So it kind of does play into Hoopa in an interesting way where both teams want to really win the early game. And generally, you'll see the teams that win the early game are going to be the ones that can keep their lead. And both of these Pokemon excel at that. And for that reason, they're both S tier. After Hoopa and after Espeon, I would say some of the defenders come to mind that are really, really strong. Crustle being the one I think that's risen to prominence the most. And that's Mamoswine that I put up there. That's got to be racist, right? If you confuse Crustle and Mamoswine. So Crustle, right? Everyone's always saying, whoa, Crustle came out of nowhere. All of a sudden, Crustle's OP. What even happened, right? The thing is Crustle's always been strong, right? And two things have led to Crustle becoming much more popular. Technically 3. It did receive some buffs last year. I think it got buffs to Sturdy. It got buffs to Rock Tomb throughout the year. X's or cooldown got lowered. And the only nerfs it's gotten recently are to damage, which is, you know, not enough to be able to nerf this Pokemon from the spot it's in. But other than that, 2 main things have happened. 1, all the other defenders around it have been nerfed. Umbreon's been nerfed. Trevenant's been nerfed. Lapras, which was really popular earlier, got nerfed. And a lot of the strong defenders getting nerfed around it's naturally going to mean next one is going to shine. But the real reason why Crustle is so good right now is the metagame revolves around evolutions, right? Evolutions evolve at level 4, so the earlier your tank can be online, the better. And Crussle's strong at level 1 with Rock Slide. So you immediately don't have to waste any time in scaling as Crustle. And you also help counter the enemy evolutions, right? If we look at the evolutions that are popular outside of Leafeon, it's Espeon, Sylveon, and Glaceon. All 3 of these Pokemon in their popular builds don't run any mobility moves, right? They might have an eject as their battle item, but stored power Psybeam, there's no mobility. There's, you can speed yourself up, but you have no hops to be able to jump over walls. Icicle Spears, Glaceon, you're not running Icy Wind, so you have no mobility there. And Sylveon typically goes Hyper Voice, so again, no mobility there. Crussle's Rock Tomb locks down the EVs, sets up ganks for the rest of the team. So it's really good into that. It's a solid counter into Slowbro, which was a tank that was really popular for a while. And it just lacks a lot of bad matchups. One of the quote-unquote bad matchups for a while was Umbreon, because Umbreon could use Umbreon's Unite move to steal away the big Crustle shield in the late game, and that would leave Crustle really vulnerable. But Umbreon's been nerfed a lot. Teams aren't prioritizing Umbreon as much. So yeah, Crustle honestly goes hand to hand with the rest of these Pokemon. Could be the best Pokemon in the tier. Realistically, it's probably maybe something like this. But yeah, all of these Pokemon are Giga broken. The last one, and I debate if this should be an S tier Pokemon or not, or it should be really high A, but I do think it's S tier, is Blastoise. When we're talking about defenders that got nerfed, Blastoise is one of the only ones that kind of out of nowhere got buffed. So Blastoise used to evolve at level 9, right, which made playing Defender Blastoise a little bit rough. Defenders in their supportive defender kind of role don't get level 9 until much later in the game, and that meant that Blastoise was lacking a lot in stats. Ever since Blastoise got the evolution to level 7, on top of that, it's been a really popular pick as a top lane Pokemon, more like an all-rounder role, and it just helps counter other melees, helps sets up different fights for your team. It does a lot of damage. It's just a solid Pokemon. You can never really go wrong with having Blastoise on your team. And, like Crustle, it dominates the game in the early game as a stun at the start. It scales really well throughout the game, good team fight. And there's not a lot of Pokemon that are built like Blastoise. I will say it has dropped a little bit in priority, only because things like Crustle and Espeon are much more popular now. But you'll still see teams pick this on their, if Espeon and Hoopa aren't up, because they got banned or first picked, and maybe Crustle was one of the bans, I think Blastoise is probably going to be the typical Pokemon you'll see out of the draft at that point. And I think that would close out the S tier for me. I think S and S plus, these are all the Pokemon we'll see in the first set of bans, or first set of picks, right? And if we're going back to our draft here, that's kind of what we have lined up. So first pick would have banned Hoopa, Leafeon, or Hoopa and then Buzzwole, and then Crustle and then Leafeon, leaving, if we look at this, the only Pokemons that are left out of that are Espeon and Blastoise. Maybe in our pretend draft they go Espeon. The other team, subsequently in this side might pick Blastoise. And then from here on, right, they have another pick. From the rest of the draft, it's mostly going to result in preferences that the team has of the Pokemon that we'll talk about in the A tier. Generally, you'll see teams look to pick things that can hide what they're playing, right? Or might take advantage of what the other team is banned. So in this case, Hoopa's banned, so we might see an Eldegoss pick, right? And then teams on this side, they may look to respond with just picking their supporter now, just so that they can hide the rest of their draft, right? Maybe they might pick Blissey or Clefable. They might look to pick their defender at this point. Maybe they want to go with Trevenant, right? And the rest of the draft from here is generally going to play out based on team preferences and maybe things that they like to play. And that's going to be comprised with a lot of the Pokemon that we see here in the A tier, right? And some of the ones I already talked about, I brought up Trevenant. This Pokemon in their most recent balance patch kind of had an interesting arc where it got nerfed on its defender kind of build, where Woodhammer got a longer cooldown, but then we saw it get buffs to both Curse and Pain Split, or yeah, I think both to Curse and Pain Split, which meant that now Tree not only can play very valuably in the bottom lane as a typical defender, but its role in the top path, where you can play it as a top lane Pokemon, kind of like Blastoise, has also been improved. I think you could, by all metrics, put this in the S tier along Blastoise. I think for some teams, they might see Blastoise and Tree as the same kind of priority. But the thing is I think Blastoise is going to be picked a lot more often than Tree, and I think leaving them in separate tiers is an important distinction to make. So yeah, all around really good. If there's only one knock on Tree, right, is that, well, as a Phantump, you are really tanky and you can go toe-to-toe with auto attacks with a lot of Pokemon. You do require a level 5 evolution, right, as opposed to Crustle, who comes online at level 4. And Blastoise, who does need level 5, does, you know, as a Squirtle, still have Water Gun. So that, for that reason and that reason alone, Tree is like just a little bit lower in priority. Outside of that, very phenomenal Pokemon. Unite move is really good to be able to set up ganks for your team. Depending on which build you go, you can be really disruptive or you can do a lot of damage, maybe a combination of both. You make it so that the evolutions that typically are really popular that do a lot of damage to you, like Sylveon, Espeon, and Glaceon, Pain Split can help nullify a lot of their effectiveness. So I would say it's, you know, it's definitely up there in the S tier or in the A tier. Beside Trevenant, a Pokemon that you'll often see together in the path, with Trevenant, is Inteleon, right? This Pokemon definitely at its time was an S tier mon, but since then, you know, it's been nerfed a little bit, and it's been nerfed, you know, twice now actually, and teams have also gotten much better at playing around Inteleon. One of the things about Inteleon is that its Snipe Shot can be body blocked, as opposed to Decidueye Spirit Shackle that just goes straight through people. So when it comes to, you know, securing objectives where your team might not have like all the control in terms of positioning, Inteleon Snipe Shot can oftentimes just get body blocked. Tanks in the team fight will be able to absorb Snipe Shots for their ranged squishies, which can kind of nullify the damage. But that being said, you know, tanks still really get chunked by Inteleon Snipe Shot. Its basic attacks are really strong. Its laning is really good. It has a lot of mobility. So it is absolutely a really, really, really strong Pokemon, and definitely sits really high in the A tier. But I'd say it's considerably weaker than some of the S tier Pokemon. The next, and I'll put these as a pair, not because they're extremely similar, but they're both evolutions that are really, really strong. We can talk about Glaceon first. This Pokemon got some much needed nerfs as well in the last patch. Doesn't mean that it's not still a really, really strong Pokemon. But those nerfs make its late game just a tad bit weaker. And on top of that, I think teams have just generally been able to get a little bit better playing around Glaceon in terms of, again, body blocking those Icicle Spears, as well as Glaceon, unlike the other evolutions, actually does need level 6. You know, Solar Blade on Leafeon, Stored Power on Espeon, and Hyper Voice on Glaceon are all really, really strong power spikes. But Icicle Spear Glaceon isn't really online until you get Ice Shard, right? And for that reason, it does kind of fall down in priority. So I will put that a little bit lower. And then Sylveon, like I said, with Espeon, you get the ability to come out level 4. You're immediately strong with that Hyper Voice. In a way, you can almost nullify Espeon's power level by Sylveon matching the Espeon. So think about this in the tournament. What you're going to be seeing a lot of is the teams might have Espeon on one side, Sylveon on one side. Both of them on opposite sides of the map are going to be taking each red buff and then going into the top path, supporting their two Pokemon that are in that top path and converging against each other. And, you know, we'll see different variations of those ganks go on. Doesn't mean necessarily it has to happen that way, but Sylveon does help nullify a little bit of Espeon's early game pressure. So that would be the case there. Also, just to get it out of the way right now, I know there might be some confusion, but EX Pokemon in tournament play are not allowed. I think that they should be allowed. I think that they should just make everyone play against them, even in competitive. But that's what the rules of the tournament are. No EX is allowed. So Miraidon and stuff, the teams don't need to ban them out. Okay, cool. So we talked a little bit about the evolutions and some attackers, and Hoopa being one of the S tier supporters, right? That doesn't mean that Eldegoss isn't pretty much up there as well, right? Arguably, Eldegoss could even be seen as an S tier Pokemon, pretty much because if Hoopa is banned out, then Eldegoss suddenly becomes that much better, right? What it does is in the top path, both of these supports are the only supports that are both ranged and can deal significant amount of damage to apply pressure. It makes it so the enemy top paths aren't able to stack. It means that your team that might be stacking attack weight or special attack specs can actually get their stacks off, because you can apply that pressure. While as Eldegoss, you don't get the power of invading that Hoopa does. You have the defensive prominence in the late game with Eldegoss's Unite move. You can run Buddy Barrier to help shield your team with that as well. So yeah, I think I'm going to put Eldegoss in the S tier. Initially, I had it in the A tier, but the more I think about it, I think teams are going to be looking to ban Hoopa a lot, and that immediately makes Eldegoss like a top tier pick. And I don't think Eldegoss really has that many weaknesses either. So I will leave it in the S tier. Cool, let's round out the A tier. And we're gonna go with some speedsters now, or a speedster at least, in Meowscarada. If Leafeon didn't exist, Meowscarada I think would be the best speedster in the game. And I still think it's a solid Pokemon. You want to be focusing on the Flower Trick double team moveset. I think the other moveset, Trailblaze Night Slash, is probably more of a B tier build, but that Flower Trick double team moveset gives, as a speedster, it gives you a lot of control with vision around the team, around the map with double team. Within team fights, you can have some poke, constantly send those double team targets towards the enemy. In 1v1 situations, you're really elusive and very hard to take down, and you do a lot of damage in a burst. And then the biggest thing, the two biggest things on Meowscarada are its passive, right? Giving it that source of invincibility and invisibility, damage amplification, and Omnivamp, right? So you typically in the end game, what you're going to see is Meowscaradas will get low. They'll use their Unite move, which they'll be invincible and then invisible afterwards in their Unite move. Healing all the damage that they're doing, healing all the damage you're taking by outputting a huge amount of damage, right? And that eject button, being able to reposition the Unite move, giving you even more flexibility with it, makes it so good. So I think we'll see a lot of Meows. I think we'll see a lot of Meows probably with Energy Amp as well. But Pokemon like Leafeon and these speedsters, the other speedster being Scyther, which we'll also definitely be seeing with Energy Amp, I think. Scyther's whole thing is that it's a reset speedster, right? So kind of like Meowscarada's Trailblaze build, but its resets it can really easily achieve via its Unite move, right? So Scyther is all about their Unite move. They do a lot of burst damage. Every time their Unite move is up, they're hoping to at least get one, if not two knockouts throughout the duration of that Unite. In the early game, its auto attacks and basic attacks do a lot of damage, has a lot of burst. And something that isn't being talked about a lot, because Scissor's been quite a bit of a meme for a while, but Scyther does give you the flexibility to be able to swap into Scissor halfway through the draft. So if you pick Scyther really early on and the enemy team ends up going like a bunch of melee Pokemon like Blaziken, maybe Trevenant, like a lot of tanky, really bulky Pokemon, there is a world where we'll see Scissor. I don't think Scissor sits with Scyther in the A tier. It'll probably be somewhere in the B tier, and we'll talk about it when we get down there. But Scissor is really, really, really strong as well in the right situations. And for that reason, Scyther also gained some value. Cool. So I think other than that, in the A tier, I probably have to give it to Gyarados and Blaziken. These are top lane Pokemon that you'll see be used a lot when Pokemon like Buzzwole and Blastoise are banned out, right? Buzz and Blast are two Pokemon that deal a lot of damage and have a lot of crowd control, and it makes melee Pokemon a lot harder to be effective on, because when you go in, you're just going to be tossed around in and about, right? But Buzz is likely going to be banned a lot. Blastoise is going to be picked away earlier or also banned, right? And then at that point, Blaziken and Gyarados shoot up in value. Even into Blastoise, they're playable. But both of these Pokemon kind of similar in that their early game is a little bit weak. In Gyarados' case, the early game is weak in a unique way where you do have the opportunity to trade with people, because Splash actually gives you a surprising amount of mobility. But obviously you are still a Carp. And Torchic in the early game, similar kind of idea. You might not be able to trade very often, but you can snag some last hits with your Aerial Ace and whatnot. Both of these Pokemon are going to be looking to get stacked in the early game and play more towards a stronger mid game. So you might see them skip the first objective of the map in efforts to just get their attack weight stacks on the top side of the map. Whatever it might be, I think they're really, really good all-rounders. Gyarados with Energy Amp, we'll see a lot of. Gyarados' Unite move actually only starts the Energy Amp buff after the Gyarados comes out of the ground. So that means that Gyarados can charge up a really long Unite move and save that Energy Amp damage amplification for right as soon as they pop out, you know, do their Dragon Breath bounce combo, and that's pretty much one-shotting any Pokemon in the game. And then, yeah, Blaziken might not have its actual Unite move, but it can win a lot of 1v1s. It's really, really strong once it gets online. And not having a Unite move and having your move swap instead means that in smaller skirmishes, when you're in 1v1s and 2v2s, you will really shine, because people might not be ready to use their Unite move, or they might not have it. And then when it comes to objectives with Overheat, you have the ability to have a really solid secure. Kind of back in the day, we would see Power Up Punch, Wicked Blow as like these charge up melee all-rounder secures, and Overheat's kind of taken that spot. Not as reliable as maybe Wicked Blow was in terms of damage output, but still up there. Cool. I think that rounds out the S tier. Maybe I would have it something like this if I were to order them. And then, you know, as we move through the draft, you know, remember, teams are going back and forth to be able to set their picks. You know, some of their picks might involve here some specialties that they have. They might involve, you know, just generically good at like S tier or A tier Pokemon. And, you know, last pick is going to be reserved a lot of times for those counter picks, right? So for the second pick side, this is where in the draft they have to make the decision: do we want Blastoise as our defender or in the top path, or are we not ready to show it yet? You know, maybe in this case they're not going to show it. They want to make sure that they lock down like one of the speedsters, right? Maybe they really want Meowscarada. Their guy's been practicing a lot of it, and they don't want to show what their Blastoise is doing yet. Maybe they just want to have an evolution to help match against the Espeon like we talked about. So they might opt to go something like Sylveon, right? And this might be what their draft looks like at this point. And as the first pick side is looking to round out their draft, right, they want to fill it out with strong Pokemon, obviously, but maybe some counter picks, maybe some situationally better Pokemon, maybe some Pokemon that they're more comfortable with, right? And a lot of the time, these are going to come from the B tier Pokemon, or maybe some of the A tier ones as well. But to start out the B tier, a Pokemon that we already had in that pretend draft is Blissey, right? This Pokemon, solid support, right? Arguably could be A tier. You know, I don't think it really matters which tier you put in, because you're going to see a lot of Blissey. The reason I put it in the B tier, though, however, is that a lot of the metagame right now is revolved around there being a range support in the top path to allow for a stronger early game. because they have the ability to do some damage and protect against invades or invade. So that for that reason, I think Blissey does come down a little bit. But other than that, it's solid, really good support, healing output. Its Unite move, one of the best pocket Unites in the game. And it's, you know, Unite move can be used as a secure on objectives as well, whether you want to use Egg Bomb or Unite move. Your Bliss Assistance, Blissey's solid. I talked about Slowbro earlier, and I might have said A tier for Slowbro, but what I wanted to say is that Slowbro sits at the top of the B tier, right? If we look at Crustle and Blastoise as like the premier defender options, and Tree as like, you know, that kind of intermediary where it's really good, maybe it just lacks a little bit, Slowbro, I think, dominates the B tier category as a tank, right? In the right setup, if you're playing against a lot of melee Pokemon or some melees, some speedsters, Slowbro can be really, really strong, right? And if we go back to our draft earlier here, where the team has selected Trevenant and they know they're playing into a Meowscarada, right? This might be the time where they want to lock down something like the Slowbro, you know, if that's what they wanted to do, right? They have the flexibility to send Tree to the top lane, right? And now Slowbro can be their defender. So it's not to say that Slowbro's not going to be a good Pokemon this game, right? It might struggle a little into Sylveon, but it'll give the good lockdown. But the reason why it's not higher in the tiers is because as a defender, it doesn't have the flexibility Blastoise and Trevenant have, in that they can play multiple roles, right? So in draft, you kind of have like this ace in your hand, like a joker almost, that you can swap to either side, depending on how the draft is flowing out. And then Crustle is just, you know, might not have the flexibility the other two have, but it makes up for it in its dominance, right? So that's why Slowbro is a little bit lower rated. If you do end up going against two mages like Gardevoir and Sylveon, or Gardevoir and Espeon, or Espeon, you know, Inteleon, whatever it might be, two special attack long range Pokemon, Slowbro has a tough time catching things out. If you're into Rock Tomb Crustle, the Slowbro lacks mobility, so you'll get stuck in the Rock Tomb, and then you'll just get wailed down by the mages. So it definitely has counterplay. The reason why it might feel really bad or really broken in ladder games is because ladder games that don't have draft, you can't account for the other team having Slowbro, right? So if you load into the game as Scyther Absol or Scyther Meowscarada, right? Those might be good Pokemon, higher rated than Slowbro, but Slowbro will be able to counter them. Vice versa, if you load into the game against like Espeon Glaceon, Slowbro suddenly loses a lot of its value. So, you know, definitely one to explain there, because I know it can be a little confusing. People always are like, Slowbro's so broken, like why, well, how could you rate it that low, right? But it definitely does come at a cost, right? And talking about defenders is Umbreon. Another one is Umbreon. I remember for a while this Pokemon was just the best Pokemon in the game, right? It sat right up there. You'd always see it picked or banned. Foul Play and Snarl have had their stints at being broken. Its Unite move has been really, really strong. It's been really tanky. And it's still a solid Pokemon. But lately, because of the mean look nerfs, it does make it so that Umbreon has a tough time catching out the really ultra mobile Pokemon, unless it's playing really, really defensively. And those Pokemon move around the map so quickly that it's hard for the Umbreon to actually keep up with them and lock them down with that mean look. And when finally you are able to cast that mean look on the Dodrio, on the Zoroark, on the Scyther, or whatever it might be, they might have just been holding their full heal the whole time. And if your mean look gets full healed after you couldn't cast it for like 10 seconds, definitely this Pokemon struggles. Its strong suit is probably mean looking on the enemy tanks, and your team just tries to wail down the tanks and knock them out instead. But I think Crustle fulfills that role just as well, if not extremely better. So a solid Pokemon. It's just there's so many other defenders around it. Umbreon definitely has to fall a little bit in priority because of that. Speaking of Pokemon that have fallen in priority is Clefable. I think this is where we look back and we're like, maybe the Clefable Moonlight nerfs that we got were healthy for the overall player base, because Clefable was getting out of hand, and 6-stacked Clefable is a problem for sure. So I think the nerfs make sense. Doesn't mean the Pokemon's unplayable, But in this supporter meta where you have a lot of range supporters in the top side of the map and Blissey's still an adequate option, Clef just kind of is an awkward spot. Gravity still counters some Pokemon really well, but we'll see Buzzwole banned a lot of the time. It's not enough to just trade Clefable for Buzzwole because Buzz is still really strong. It's decent against Scyther. Pokemon that maybe we haven't talked about, like Zoroark, it's really good into. So if those Pokemon get picked higher in the draft, maybe we could see Clefable be picked to counter them. But generally, teams are going to wait to pick their counterable Pokemon when the other team has shown their hand a little bit. So Clefable does drop a little in priority. But that being said, there was this composition that was really strong. That was like Inteleon, Glaceon, Clefable with two tanks. And you would just run at the other team with a bunch of damage, Clef healing them all the way. And it was like this death ball kind of comp. All those Pokemon have been nerfed, but we could still see this Pokemon be picked in that kind of strategy. It's just the other support options will be a little bit better. In terms of other Pokemon in this tier, I think Dodrio, definitely a really, really strong speedster. And in some cases, it will be even higher in priority for certain teams. The reason why Dodrio is going to be so good is EUIC is going to be an in-person event. And when you're playing with no delay, you really get to take advantage of all the mobility that Dodrio has, whether you're using your boosted auto that's charged up with your sprint gauge to dodge moves, even some unite moves. You can activate your full heal just that much quicker. And just having that smoother gameplay experience will mean that, Pokemon like Dodrio, like Zoroark, and as a result, a combination of those Comfey will definitely be solid picks. I think we'll see teams opt for this type of strategy oftentimes, and it'll look like it's S tier because it'll feel like it's S tier, right? With either Dodrio Comfey or Zoro Comfey. But because of the way the draft goes out, I think it might be tough for teams to be able to lock this down without the other team being able to respond with things like Slowbro. I talked about Blissey earlier. I think it's gonna get picked as if it's an A tier Pokemon, but because the ranged Pokemon kind of dominate the top side of the map, and those are the Pokemon that are really popular in the support role, I wanted to put a gap in between them. Honestly, it could be A tier, it could be at the top of the B. It's around the same, right? This would be fine. I think this is fine. Sounds good. In terms of the rest of the Pokemon, I think some attackers probably deserve some love at this point. And a lot of Pokemon will sit in the B tier. Two of the ones that are kind of similar, maybe even three, we could just group them all together. That will just be matchup dependent and player preference dependent, are Candle, Gardevoir, and Delphox. So with these Pokemon, right, they all in the early game are kind of weak and vulnerable. So if you put them in the jungle, they could be invaded. If you put them in the raw in the paths, they might struggle as well. So they require some level of help from your team, but that's not that hard to achieve nowadays, right? You give them an evolution, right? Like a level 4 Ganker. So maybe you have a Glaceon or an Espeon or a Sylveon on your team. They take the red buff, go to top, right? And then the Candle, Gardevoir, Delphox, you'll often see them start the game jungle splitting, taking the blue buff, and then going down into the paths, right? So I think all three of these are very similar in nature. Not to say that they're all interchangeable per se, but I think they kind of sit in the similar kind of value. Lane Boy, thank you for the $5 super chat. In solo duo trio ladder, how good is stacking Eld as a third item with muscle and XP share? For ladder games, stacking Eld is fine. I think teams will allow you to get away with stacking. And if you want to do it, I think it's a good way to scale. In more competitive games, especially in a tournament like AEOS Cup, where everyone's going to be on the top of the game and they're going to be really sharp, Eldegoss just isn't going to have the opportunity to get a lot of stacks. And it has really good item options like Resonant Guard and Buddy Barrier that already help keep your team alive without the investment of you having to be selfish on the Pokemon. So For solo duo trio, go for it. For competitive games, I think you probably won't see it much. Cool. So these three attackers, I think the other thing I wanted to mention is regions like Brazil, Latin America, North and South, see Candle as like a tier above some of the other Pokemon. I think maybe it's a result of how their metagames developed. Maybe their players are better at them. Maybe truly it is just a better Pokemon and the rest of the world hasn't used it as much as they have. But I think we'll see these three Pokemon in their builds, whether it's Fire, Spin, Delphox. Honestly, most of the all the guard builds could work as long as you're not doubled up on like Moonblast, Future Sight. And then Candle, we could see all the builds be played as well. And there's a lot of Pokemon I think that could sit in the S tier though, right? I think Venusaur is probably in a similar case, right? A little bit weaker in the early game, but it has that Solar Beam, which is a better secure compared to the other ones, more burst from its Unite, but it's less control oriented, right? Where these three Pokemon can offer a level of control that Venusaur won't. But we'll see some Venusaur gameplay. Certainly, I think it's a solid Pokemon. And definitely like really strong into things like Glaceon and Espeon. If your team is doing well and you can one-shot them even into Inteleon. And if your team's the one that's losing and you've dropped some pads down, then Venusaur might be a little weaker as well. And I think Mew, probably similar, right? Idea. Mew is a little bit more of a flexible Pokemon, and I think Mew finally has found its role as like the jack of all trades, but maybe master of none. You know, it's got Solar Beam and it has a long range nuke, but its Solar Beam is not as good as Venusaur's Solar Beam, right? It has mobility and it has a lot of good utility, but for that it makes up it has its weaknesses where it's really slow at farming. It's not good without levels. It's hard to get levels on this Pokemon, and it has awkward phases in the game. So still really strong. We'll see teams play Mew for sure. A lot of teams might have players that are just more comfortable on it, but it is kind of lower. It is kind of lower than where it used to be at some point. Let's see. Let's talk about some all-rounders that we might get to see. I think Lucario, when a lot of these other Pokemon are pulled out of the pool and we don't see them as much, Lucario will definitely go up. Maybe even Garchomp more so, actually. When we start to see Buzz and Blast out of the pool, Pokemon that rely on not getting just perma CC'd comboed like Garchomp definitely go much higher up in value. And I think in some cases Garchomp might even be considered an A tier Pokemon. I could see the argument of Garchomp being higher up just because when Buzz and Blast are out of the pool, it's just that much better. It also can maybe be seen as a counter pick to Gyarados in the early game, especially if you give Garchomp a Comfey. It has a lot of good matchups. Things like being able to Dragon Rush the Altaria to your side, kind of like what Blaziken can do. Being really, really tanky, having your Unite move that can make you really tanky is really solid as well. But by the same vein, right, there's Pokemon like Urshifu, who in the right situations can be played. I think teams might often try to use this as a counter pick to speedsters in the game to have a guaranteed lockdown. You might see teams that want to be able to flip objectives or be good at defending flips, go for Urshifu. So I don't think Urshifu will be something we'll see necessarily earlier in the tournament unless teams are trying to flip. But as the tournament goes later on, if there's teams that are changing up their playstyle, I think one of the first Pokemon we see people bring out is Urshifu. Urshifu's Unite move, right, gives you that guaranteed lockdown in the ult that can bypass full heal. In a way, right, Urshi's ult can be countered by full heal, but an ult that can't be countered by full heal necessarily is Mimikyu. If you've been watching me like cover tournaments over the last month or so, you would know that I'm not a big fan of Mimikyu. I don't think it's as good as the teams make it out to be. But if I'm making a tier list based on what I think the meta is going to look like, Mimikyu is definitely a part of the meta. We see a lot of teams use Mimikyu to apply early pressure and pressure in the mid game. With its either Shadow Claw resets or Shadow Claw being amplified, or its player off, giving it some invincibility, and then the shadow sneak resets, being able to just go through teams. But one of the biggest strengths of Mimikyu, in my opinion, is its Unite move, right? I think we haven't seen the full potential of it, but a lot of times Mimikyu Unite move can be used to counter things like a Blastoise Unite, right? Blastoise surfs into your team and it's gonna, get a big Hydro Typhoon, boom. You can Mimikyu out the Blastoise, run past the Blastoise with the rest of your team, and try to take them down, nullifying a Pokemon completely out of the fight. So we'll see some Mimikyu. I'm not a fan of it, but it is going to be out there. The reason why I'm not a fan of it is I think a lot of its play is very telegraphed. Shadow Sneak requires you to be able to dash across the map through walls, which can be covered by your teammates. If you're playing Trevenant or Crustle and you stand in front of the Shadow Sneak, it'll go on to you. Mimikyu's not going to want to engage on that. And outside of that, it's a really immobile Pokemon if it doesn't land its Shadow Sneaks. So for that reason, I don't think I value it lower personally, but I do think we'll see a lot of it played. Other than that, we talked a little bit about Lucario, but Lucario is just a good, consistent Pokemon. If you don't know what to play topside and you want something that isn't going to be immediately countered by the other team, you can just pick Lucario. It's safe. It can exist on the side of the map. It can contest farm with Power Up Punch. It's tanky. So it's not like a phenomenal Pokemon, but it does feel like the all-rounder of all-rounders in a way. And aside from that, this might be a bit of a hot take because we don't see it get played a lot, but with Japanese and international teams also being invited to the tournament, I think it's only fair to say that Dragonite will be a part of the meta in some shape or form. Hyper Beam did get a small nerf, but it doesn't mean that it is any less good at securing objectives. At the end of the day, Pokemon Unite is about securing the objective at the end of the map, and Dragonite's one of the best Pokemon to do that. It's not bad at level 5 with Dragon Dance and red buff autos while you're in the early game. It scales really well throughout the late game. It's tanky. It might lack some range, but you can make up with that at the rest of your draft. So we'll definitely see some Dragonite, maybe not as much as some of the other Pokemon, but I would keep my eye out for it. I'll add one more Pokemon here that I do think we might see, and we'll put that towards the end of the B tier, is Mr. Mime. Mr. Mime's Unite move gives you an engage tool that lets you be very sticky to ranged Pokemon. Ranged Pokemon like Glaceon really hate this Unite move, and Espeon, because if they don't have their eject buttons up, they're definitely getting stuck by this. And even with eject button up, Mime can just follow them with their own eject. So for that reason, like, having that in the late game is such a nice option. In the early game, Mime is one of the best tanks in the game to farm. So Mime is a supporter, but make no mistake, it'll get played more in a defender kind of role. Replacing things like Slowbro or Blastoise in the bot lane, maybe Trevenant. If some of those Pokemon get banned out and we need to go deeper into the pool, Mr. Mime definitely will be one that we get to see. And there's a lot of good Mime players that are going to be at the tournament as well, right? I mean, Bruv, obviously very well known for playing Mime. I'm sure we'll probably get to see him on some Mime. But even on GT, we'll see some Mime get played, I think. And I think a lot of teams will probably end up relying on Mime after the other tanks get banned out throughout the draft. I think that's probably it. If I'm looking at the rest of the Pokemon, is there anything else that I would want to put in that tier? There are individual players that might play some Pokemon that might warrant a B tier pick. Maybe I'll say Metagross, right? I think Metagross is another option within these all-rounders that we might get to see some play. It's really tanky. It's really good in the side lanes. It might have a weak early game. The Unite move might be a little janky. But again, it's going to come down to team's preference when things like Buzz and Blastoise and Tree are picked or banned away, what they're going to send to that top side of the map. And while Garchomp could be one angle, right, with an auto attacker that can rip objectives and can rip farm and has the ability to, reposition the enemy team, Metagross is like almost like a pseudo, just a tank in terms of being able to take damage with Gyro Ball and stay alive. consistent damage in an AoE, hard to bring down, and then obviously its Unite move is high risk, but really high reward as well. Desi, I think Desi as well, and Talon are probably good examples of B tier attackers and a Speedster, right? Definitely lower than some of the other Pokemon we talked about. So we could say that the tier is tiered itself. So I do think these two Pokemon are solid. Desi, it's a fine sniper that can still get picked. If you can outrange the things like the EVs, I think Desi is really, really strong. But its early game being as weak as it is, it being stack reliant, right? Whereas Venusaur doesn't really need stacks. I think Desi kind of is a lot more stack reliant, and its Unite move being a little bit weaker generally than some of the other attackers. It is a little lower. But it is a good sniper. It offers your team a solid secure from range. It can help set up opportunities with Shadow Sneak. So a lot of good looks that you could have with this Pokemon. I see a lot of people asking for Cram, because we did see some Cram as well in the March finals from NA as well, and I think we could probably put Cram in the B tier as well. Cram is probably better than the Pokemon that I would imagine being in the C tier. So yeah, if you're playing Dive, Air/Cram, it is unique out of the other attackers and being that hyper mobile attacker. Its Unite move is hit or miss, right? Depending on the draft, Cramran can struggle really bad with this Unite move. I would imagine if we see things like Trevenant being played in the top lane, Cramran might not be seen as much because its Unite move is quite useless in the tree. The Pain Split tree can just stand on top of the Cramran and essentially tank the entire ult while dealing damage back to it. And Cram can definitely struggle to be able to be very mobile with its Dive Air/ build because it is susceptible to CC. But it is, it's a level 4, a Pokemon that can come online level 4. It's a good laner. It has all the tools to be able to be potentially good, but it might be lacking in some aspects. I think that's a good B tier. I think that looks like a solid B tier. I think all of these Pokemon in the order that they're presented would probably be the order of operations I would give them. Maybe some of these have some mixing to do, but generally it looks pretty solid to me. Brazilian team one playing Cramorant as well. Well, maybe I'm undervaluing Cramorant, and we'll have to see how it does in London. But cool, let's move on to the C tier. I know a Pokemon some people are asking about was A9. I think A9 has potential. I think A9's really strong into Pokemon that love to dive in front of your face. And in fact, I think A9's not even that bad Pokemon into Buzzwole, right? Which is, one of the god tier Pokemon of the patch. But A9 struggles really hard into the snipers just because you get outranged. It's awkward to position in the endgame because of its passive, right? Sometimes revealing it out. And not only because of its passive, but because Blizzard, the way you deal a majority of your damage is Blizzard colliding into walls. So people can play around natural walls in the game to provide them like a barrier to A9's damage. So for that reason, I think A9 is a little bit weaker. And with all the other attackers existing, I would say they're generally gonna be stronger. But we could see some A9. We could see some A9 throughout the tournament, for sure. Some niche picks that I think are situationally really strong. We might see down here in the C tier, like Aegislash. Aegislash has been played in some games, maybe not all the way leading up to the finals, but it does have successful moments in tournament play. It's a decent option into many speedsters because Wide Guard sets up an instant wall that makes you really tanky. You have a stun and you have guaranteed burst damage with your basic attacks, which can lock onto targets, so you don't need to aim it. So the combination of both being really tanky and having that burst can be nice. It gives your team a solid secure option. So I don't think it's a great Pokemon by any means, but in like a niche tier, right? In the right situation, I think people can definitely pick Aegislash and make it work. I expect we'll see at least a little bit throughout the weekend. Sableye is another really good example of a niche Pokemon, right? Obviously, it's seen a lot of nerfs since it's come out, And generally when you pick it, it means that you're not picking a supporter beside it. So it will nullify some of the healing you could get from other supports when you pick Sableye. But being able to be invisible throughout the map, develop a point lead for your team, be disruptive on enemy backline, provide vision, get stuns, jungle invade if the enemy team has a weak jungler, right? All of those tools definitely can be conclusive to a winning strategy. And I'm almost certain there's got to be at least 3 or 4 teams that have a pocket comp with Sableye ready to go for EUIC. So we'll see a lot of this Pokemon. We won't see it. It won't be a Pokemon that's necessarily fought over in the draft, but teams will have it as a pocket strategy for sure. Other than that, let's see. If we want to be on the topic of kind of niche and weird supporters, I think Wiggly definitely could see some play. The other defenders are all really, really good, but Wiggly can provide some anti-measures into enemy speedsters. Wiggly can be disruptive with Q-Charm, and then the shielding is also really nice. You solo with Clef, and it's still decent. Cool. Yeah, I think this is for more competitive in the AEOS Cup that's coming up. But for solo queue, yeah, decent. I would say it's definitely B tier. Other Pokemon in this tier, I think one that has been a bit of a letdown, at least for me, has been Dragapult. I think a lot of people, even myself included, had this a little bit higher up. It did get nerfed, but we never really got to see it shine in competitive. And I think for how squishy it is, it's just too difficult to make work. It's possible some teams might be ready with some Dragapult strategies, but you will need something like a Blissey to protect it and to be able to pocket for it, basically. Snorlax. Oh, I guess Snorlax we could have put in the B tier. That's probably something I should have left in the B tier. Snorlax just a generically good tank. Like Lucario, I said, is like the all-rounder of tanks. Snorlax is like the defender of defenders, you know? He goes in there, he stuns, he goes to sleep, he picks up his HP. Very, very basic kind of tank. Its strength is it's really good in the early game, and it's never necessarily bad, but it's not gonna outshine most of the other defenders. A lot of other Pokemon I think exist in this tier. Pikachu, similar to A9. The other control mages generally better. Pikachu is not bad. It doesn't feel like Pikachu has something that's special about him anymore, you know? Volt Tackle is annoying, but Volt Tackle also puts you in a vulnerable position, can be countered by Full Heal, and it's not like the other attackers don't have viable options as well to be able to control the enemy team. So I think Pikachu just sits down here. He's doing all right. We might see some of it. I doubt we'll see some Pikachu, but we might. Mamoswine, I think, right? Another Pokemon that feels, in theory, it should be strong, but it's just up against a lot of really good Pokemon that exist in their roles, right? All the defenders are so good. It's kind of hard to justify picking Mamoswine, but it's not bad. You know, it can be disruptive, but again, he doesn't have like a specialty to him, right? There's no like oomph that Mamoswine has. Like, I guess its basic attacks can stun, and it has the freeze, but it's not like the defenders are bad, right? Like, I just don't see the oomph that Mamoswine can provide. Scissor, I think Scissor, actually, I rate Scissor pretty high. I think it's an option that you can go if you selected Scyther and the game looks like it might be better for Scissor, or as a last pick. Scissor definitely not great into a lot of heavy magic damage, but I think despite that, you'll see that if the enemy team has some magic damage, right, some special attack damage, and then just some other melee Pokemon that Scissor can go toe-to-toe with, it could definitely be a viable option. And if you get ahead, you just one-shot the ranged Pokemon anyway, right? The real weakness that Scissor has is that as an all-rounder, it doesn't have any secure, right? It doesn't have secure in the lane. So when it's left 1v1, a lot of the other all-rounders can out-secure it or out-farm it. And then on objectives, you're really tanky, you do a lot of damage, but you don't have any secure either. So I do think it's a lot weaker from that perspective. Other than that, in the C tier, I think Zard, right? Its Unite move honestly is not that bad, right? You can pick people up. It's really not that bad into evolutions, especially, but it does have an awkward leveling curve where it's really weak in the early game, like really weak in the lane. So you have to put it in the jungle. And if you're putting it in the jungle, it's a liability, right? So if you did a jungle split the way you do with evolutions and Zard gets like the early game blue buff and the rest of the farm, or something like that, and you help bring it online, it can work. Is it going to be better than some of the other attackers that are control mages? Maybe not, but it does give you a more scaling auto attack kind of Pokemon. So definitely think it's better than what we'll probably end up seeing in the D tier. But let's see, anything else? Not Water Bear. I don't think Lapras. Goodra. I think Goodra can be played not as a defender role, like not in the bottom lane defender kind of role, but definitely in the top path, right? In place of maybe spots where we might see something like Garchomp, when teams are looking for something a little bit tankier that could just sit up there. Goodra's definitely not a bad option. You do need things like Blastoise and Buzzwole to be removed for Goodra to be able to shine, but it could work. Machamp, I think we could put Machamp in the C tier. NA1 with it in the AEOS play-ins, right? If there's some good Machamp players, they could definitely try it out. I think I've seen some mission Machamps here and there as well. So yeah, I think Machamp definitely could see some play. We could put that higher. It's tanky, you know, it has decent early game secure. My problem with Machamp is this game is going to be played in person and online instead of online. And Machamp's Unite move in person is a lot easier to dodge and a lot easier to get out of because you're going to be playing on no ping than some of the other Pokemon are. So I think deeper in the tournament, I don't think we'll see a lot of this Pokemon, but it is probably better than the bottom of the barrel that exists out there. Absol is not an awful speedster, right? Really explosive, a little bit crit reliant. Has a decent Unite move after it's gotten buffed recently, right? For a lot of burst damage. And if Absol snowballs, if Absol is a good first gank, it's definitely a really scary speedster. It's just, if it doesn't have a good early game, and it ends up falling behind, it doesn't have a lot of great tools to be able to come back into the game. But it is rated a little bit lower down there. Let's see. Other than that, I think that's probably it. What I'll do here is we'll add a row here, and we'll say EX Mons, so we can have an actual F tier, because these aren't allowed. And then in the D tier, I think these are Pokemon that are like pretty weak, but not unplayably weak. So like things like Lapras, we might see it, probably not. It's maybe not as weak as something like Duraludon or T-Tar, maybe Serena, right? These Pokemon, especially T-Tar and Serena in competitive, require too many resources to come online. And in the time that these Pokemon can get scaled up, I think teams will be able to abuse and exploit your weaknesses around the map. So I definitely rate these pretty low. I think Water Bear just got nerfed to the point where it's kind of unplayable. I'm not a big fan of it. I don't think we'll really see it at all. What else probably sits down there? Greedent, you know, maybe Greedent might see some play with teams trying to, maybe teams have some pocket score comp setups or whatever. If we do see it, it'll probably be Covet Belch, but it's not a good Pokemon. Gengar as well in hand with Serena, T-Tar. It just takes too long to come online, and in the time that it's online, the enemy team has probably rolled away with the game, right? But all of these Pokemon, Tarina, Gengar, Serena, T-Tar, if these Pokemon were like given 2 minutes, right? Maybe in the first 2 minutes, no one's allowed to fight each other, right? First 2 to 3 minutes, and everyone starts the game after that, these Pokemon would be a lot better because they're not bad in the late game, right? right? You might feel like, okay, wait, Serena in the late game is broken. Like, how could you rate it in the F tier? It's just by the time Serena gets to the late game, by the time he gets level 6, it's already fallen off. And then I think these other Pokemon are like playable, but probably still recognized as pretty weak. Maybe Zera is the best of them. Like Voltage, Zera is not bad, but it's just, it doesn't provide anything unique that other speedsters don't necessarily already have. And it's not as strong in the early game as all the other speedsters where they all come online much sooner. Greninja and Cinder, just auto attack Pokemon that play at their range. They don't offer enough to the team. We saw some Cinder in like the EU qualifiers, and we've seen some Greninja in the NA qualifiers, right? There's a couple teams that might use these Pokemon, but we're talking about the AEOS Cup finals where the best teams from every region are coming together and being able to play against each other. I don't think we'll see some of those Pokemon. And same thing goes for Azu. Just, it doesn't, like, it's definitely a cool Pokemon, but, you know, its crits being able to be countered by tanking it because crits only apply on solo hit targets for Azu, and not being particularly great in the late game, and also the existence of all these other really strong all-rounders in the game. I just don't see Azu as that strong. And yeah, I mean, I think that's my tier list. I think I like the curve of it, how most of the Pokemon, the biggest tier is the B tier. It's kind of like a sideways triangle, you know, like boom. Aesthetically, it looks very pleasing to look at, in my opinion. But I tried to answer some of your questions that you guys might have had. But if anyone has like any big questions or any big things, I'd be happy to talk about them. How would I rank the EX Mons? If I could, Miraidon would be like S++. I think Mewtwo Y would be S or A. I think Zacian would be A, maybe S, and then Mewtwo X maybe would be like B or C, something like that. But this is the order that they're good in, I think, and maybe these are interchangeable.